Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class, Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we'll be discussing, ideally, it's quite a few verses, but I want to get through most of them, 2.57 to 2.65. So starting with verse 57 of chapter 2. A heads up, our next class will be held on Sunday, June 23rd at 9:30 a.m. And we'll hopefully finish all the verses in chapter 2 in our next class, and then move on to chapter 3, and we'll start to read Sri Aurobindo's commentary on chapter 3. But that's a heads up. So for next class, I want you guys to reread verses 2.65 to 2.72, the last 8 verses. 65 to 72 of chapter 2. You've already read Sri Aurobindo's commentary, and there are going to be study questions. The first 2 study questions will be the last 2 study questions of this week. I hope it's not too confusing, because I gave you guys the option this time only to answer the first 2 questions if you were pressed for time this week. So if you did not answer questions 3 and 4 for this class of study questions, they're going to be 1 and 2 of next class's study questions. Answer them. If you already answered them today, you don't need to. You can skip 1 and 2 and just do the other questions, which I'll come up with, based on the last verses of chapter 2. I hope that's not too confusing. Okay, so now let's begin. One thing I forgot to mention last time regarding Arjuna's momentous question, 2.54, Stita Pragyasya ka bhasha samadhistasya Keshava. Arjuna asks Krishna, how exactly does a person in samadhi behave? How does that person walk? How does that person sit? How does that person talk? And so on and so forth. And my main claim was Krishna is not answering Arjuna's question directly, and deliberately so. He's saying you're barking up the wrong tree. There are no real external signs of a person in samadhi. All the signs, the real signs, are internal. And it's very easy to fake samadhi with external signs, but that's not the real thing. But there's one interpreter I found, one commentator, who takes a bit of a different tack. I mean, that this person agrees with that interpretation, but also suggests something different. Sridhara, who is a follower of Shankara, in his commentary, he says you can also take the question literally. And you can take Krishna's answer to the question in a more literal way, as a literal answering of Arjuna's question. And that what Sridhara tries to do is find places in verses where Krishna seems to be suggesting external signs of how a person in samadhi behaves. And I'll just mention the verses. Verse 57 of chapter 2, verse 61 and verse 64, where Sridhara is saying, see, here Krishna is saying, this is how a person in samadhi talks, for instance, and this and that. So I don't think this is a particularly fruitful kind of interpretation, but I wanted to flag that there is at least one commentator who thinks that Krishna is directly answering Arjuna's question and taking it literally. Okay, so now let's come to verse 57. Please open your app if it's not already open, and let's look at verse 57, and please repeat after me. Yaha sarvatranabhisnehas tat tat prapya shubha shubham nabhinandati na dveshti tasya prajna pratisthita. Okay, so as usual, we're going to go through the anvaya, which is a rearrangement of the words in the shloka to make the meaning of the shloka clearer. Yaha sarvatra anabhisneha. That person who everywhere, under all circumstances, is free from abhisneha, which means a kind of attachment or liking. Tat tat shubha ashubham prapya. But actually it should mean something more general, not just liking, like or dislike, any kind of passion. Tat tat shubha ashubham prapya. When you get something really pleasant to you, something that you really want or love, you don't become elated and, jump up and down. And when you get something ashubham, something not so great that you don't like, you don't become dejected and depressed and, oh, why did this happen to me and this and that. Equal under all circumstances. Na abhinandati, na dveshti. So here again, so you don't lament your situation, your fate, if you are confronted with something bad, undesirable. And you're not extremely ecstatic in a very emotional and rajasic way when you get something you want. But you take everything as the divine will, whether good or bad. Tasya prajñā pratisthita. Okay, that person's intelligence or buddhi is founded firmly in wisdom. So the main takeaway from this verse seems to me that we should, one test I think for us as spiritual aspirants is to, and we should always remember that it's a kind of, you should test ourselves in both directions. Usually the test we think in terms of when we face some tragedy or some kind of suffering, how do we behave? Do we behave like a spiritual aspirant or do we behave like a worldly person? Are we completely devastated and it takes us years to recover from it? Or can we pick ourselves back up? But even in the midst of happiness, when we get what we want, how do we behave? We think it's easy to be spiritual in happiness. In some ways, it's much harder to be spiritual when you get what you want. Because then, at least implicitly you're taking credit for what you're doing and what happened to you, your success and all that. And you get puffed up. Whereas with suffering, sometimes Swamiji says, suffering is a great eye-opener. Because in suffering makes you humble. But even then, it's really important to try to keep up the attitude of a spiritual aspirant. So in both situations, when you get what you want, are you really a spiritual aspirant, taking it as divine will? And you're not the doer, but this is a gift of God. And when you're faced with unfortunate circumstances, can you maintain that equality? Next verse. 2.58. Yada samharate chayam kurmonganiva sarvashah indriyani indriyarthebhyah tasya prajñā pratisthita. Okay, so this is the first of a number of beautiful analogies used by Sri Krishna to explain the state of a realized soul, somebody who is in a natural state of samadhi. Yada, when, ja kurmaha sarvashah angani eva, just as when a tortoise withdraws its limbs into its shell. Just so, the realized soul, I am indriya arthebhya indriyani samharate. The realized soul will withdraw his or her sense organs from sense objects. Tasya prajñā pratisthita. This is the person who has a firmly grounded buddhi, intelligence, sthita prajñā. So there are a couple things to mention here. One thing is, Ramanuja here has an interesting interpretation. He's taking this to be a logical sequence starting from verse 55, if you remember, the very first verse in Krishna's answer, Sri Krishna's answer to Arjuna. When the person has completely removed all desires from one's heart, then one can be called a person in samadhi, so on. 55, 56, 57, 58. These four verses Ramanuja takes as a set. And he says that these are four stages in what he calls jnana nishtha. So remember, we need a little bit of, again, background in Ramanuja's framework here. He reads this whole chapter as Krishna telling Arjuna, you need to realize that you are not the body, you are not the mind, you are the Jivatman, an eternal individual soul, a child of God, which is an amsha of God, a part of God, a portion of God, a spark of God. And you need to realize yourself as the Atman, separate from the body-mind complex. That's what Ramanuja calls Jnana Yoga. And it's a prerequisite for the highest kind of bhakti yoga where you can you constantly think of God without any worldly distractions. Okay. So now, in that context, Ramanuja is saying, Krishna, for sadhakas, for spiritual aspirants, one of the things I mentioned last time was Shankara's beautiful statement that what Krishna describes as the qualities of a realized soul, we as spiritual aspirants should try to cultivate as spiritual aspirants. The things that come naturally to the realized soul, we have to work at, right? So in that context, Ramanuja is agreeing with Shankara that these are all very relevant verses for spiritual aspirants. But he specifically argues, and this is quite interesting and controversial, you don't have to agree, but I'm just presenting it to you. He's saying that 58, and it's in reverse order, the 4 stages. So that 58 corresponds to the lowest stage of Jnana Nishtha, which means when you're first starting on the path of Jnana Yoga, when you're first trying to realize the Atman, your true nature as an individual soul, what do? Like the tortoise, you should try to restrain the sense organs from sense objects. Next stage, 1 stage higher up, verse 57. Under all circumstances, whether fortunate, unfortunate, favorable, unfavorable, happy, sad, you should try to remain equanimous, equal under all circumstances. Then 56, the mind should be undisturbed even in the face of great suffering, in the case of great happiness, which is kind of similar to 57. But in any case, he takes to be 1 step up even from 57. And then the highest is when you've completely eliminated all desires from the mind, which is verse 55, sorry. Prajahati yada kaman sarvan patmanogatan. Okay? So this is Ramanuja's reading. It's interesting. And the other thing I wanted to mention is why this analogy. These analogies is not just for poetic value, for beauty. We should always ask ourselves, what's the spiritual and philosophical significance of these analogies that Sri Krishna uses? So why is he likening the realized soul and spiritual aspirants, a good spiritual aspirant, to a tortoise withdrawing its limbs? Well, when does a tortoise do that? To protect itself when it's going to be attacked. So I think what Krishna is suggesting is, as a spiritual aspirant, you don't want to turn the sense objects into enemies. That's not the purpose. But you as a spiritual aspirant, to protect yourself, are doing this. Because sometimes we ask ourselves, this sounds too extreme. I don't want to be world shunning and this and that. But it's for your own protection. That's the idea. So you're restraining the sense organs from sense objects with the purpose of protecting your higher self and helping your spiritual life. That's the idea. That's my suggestion. You can think about it for yourself. Why this tortoise analogy? There's always some spiritual significance to why he uses these analogies. That's my opinion. Okay, next verse. Now we get into this really interesting... go ahead.
Just elaborating on... It really means here to get away from the environment that can...
Well, the thing is there are different...
What does it really mean, withdraw? Is it just if, something can be disturbing, because you look at it, it can raise those samskaras. You have to look away, not... hear the sound.
I think it depends. It depends on the spiritual aspirant, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer. Sri Aurobindo says that the higher achievement is, even when you're confronted with sense objects, you don't flee from them. You don't have to turn away, but you don't have that inner raga or dvesha, that inner liking or disliking, that attachment. That's a very high state. But realistically, Sri Ramakrishna brings us down to earth, and he says in the gospel many times, he says, speaking of a male spiritual aspirant, he says, even a spiritual aspirant who is highly evolved, who is almost free from desire, when confronted with a beautiful woman, mukhe jal chore, he starts to salivate. And he starts feeling lust for that person. So he's not talking about ordinary worldly people. Nishkamero kam hoy, mukhe jal chore, he says in Bangla. So you have to be practical, and it's very easy here for self-deception to creep in, and think yourself to be above sense pleasures and sense objects. So, I can do everything the same way that ordinary people are, but internally I'm a tyagi, I'm a sannyasi, I'm a spiritual aspirant. I'm not actually attracted. It's dangerous. So you have to monitor. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary for you to stay away from sense objects. You shouldn't tell somebody who has an addiction to alcohol or cigarettes, go ahead and, go to bars and hang out with your friends. That's terrible advice. There's a period when you need to separate yourself from the sense objects. At a much higher stage, even in the face of those sense objects, you're not going to be tempted. But this brings us to the next verse. That's why this next verse is so important. Because until we have realized our true nature as souls, separate from the body-mind complex, we're not safe. That's what this next verse says, actually. So, Vishaya vinivattante, verse 59. Niraharasya dehinaha rasavajjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate. It's a really interesting and important verse. Niraharasya, for the person who literally abstains from food. So somebody who seems to be engaging in physical austerities, fasting, but most commentators take it to have a broader meaning. Ahara does not just mean food, but abstaining from sense indulgences, sense pleasures. Dehinaha, the embodied person. Vishayaha rasavajyam vinivartante. For the abstemious person, the austere person, the spiritual aspirant, what you'll find is you may not be engaging in, you may not be indulging in these sense pleasures. But rasavajyam, actually this anvaya here is a little bit problematic. It should be really in the next sentence, I think. The problem is the rasa, the taste for the sense pleasures, the sense objects remains.
The predilection?
The predilection for, the taste for it, the attachment for, that's the problem. So even when you're abstaining from a particular sense indulgence, you still like it. This whole month, Narayana and I are going on a no sweets diet. It's not that I don't like sweets. I like sweets. That's the whole purpose of the austerity. You're abstaining. But then after June, all bets are off. Lord, we'll see. That's the real test. Okay. All right. But now, asya rasaha api param dristvani vartate. When you have realized the param, the supreme, asya rasaha api nivartate, even that taste goes away. That taste for sense objects, sense pleasures. Rasa is the term used. So this is really important. First of all, there's one issue about what exactly does param mean? Realizing param, the supreme. You might think it just means the supreme Brahman. It might. Some people, Sri Aurobindo takes it to mean realization of God. Even Sri Ramakrishna sometimes in the Gospel suggests that craving for sense pleasures and worldly things doesn't completely go away until you have realized God. Ramanuja, though, in the context of his framework, he's reading this whole chapter in the context of Jnana Yoga with the aim of realizing your eternal nature as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. He's saying the param here refers to the Atman, the Jivatman, the individual soul. And that's a very high realization too, but it's not the highest. The highest is realization of Vishnu. That requires bhakti yoga, the practice of bhakti yoga. This is one step before that. Okay? So he takes param here, Ramanuja, to mean the Atman. So once you realize the Atman, then the taste for sense object goes away. Sense objects. Okay? And I think Sri Aurobindo's commentary here is nice, actually. And this is one of those places where if you click on the second to the left, second from the left, there's a text box. You click on it and you'll get his commentary. It's not always perfect. This case, I actually like it. And he gives a citation, too. It's from Vedanta Gita, pages 99 to 100. It's quite nice. Okay. He says, let's read along. The embodied soul. Huh?
Well, I didn't know that.
Well, now you know. Knowing is half the battle. The embodied soul, having a body. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier.
You mentioned actually.
I did, right? Yeah. The embodied soul, having a body, has to support it normally by food for its normal physical action. By abstention from food, so here Sri Aurobindo is taking ahara in the literal sense as food. By abstention from food, it simply removes from itself the physical contact with the object of sense, but does not get rid of the inner relation, the rasa, which makes that contact hurtful. It retains the pleasure of the sense in the object, the rasa, the liking and disliking. For rasa has two sides. It's not just liking. The soul must, on the contrary, be capable of enduring the physical contact without suffering inwardly the sensuous reaction. Otherwise, there's nivritti, cessation of the object, vishayavinivartante. Meaning you're removing yourself from a situation in which you're confronted with that sense object. But no subjective cessation, no nivritti of the mind. But the senses are of the mind, subjective, and subjective cessation of the rasa is the only real sign of mastery. So the real mastery is not whether you can avoid sense objects, but in the midst of the sense objects, can you restrain your mind and prevent it from going out and either liking or disliking that object? Then he says, but this is crucial, but how is this desireless contact with objects, this unsensuous use of the senses possible? It is possible, param drishtva, by the vision of the Supreme, param, the soul, the purusha, God, Purushottama, and by living in the yoga, in union or oneness of the whole subjective being with that. through the yoga of the intelligence, buddhi yoga. For the one soul is calm, satisfied in its own delight, and that delight, free from duality, can take, once we see the supreme thing in us and fix the mind and will on that, the place of the sensuous, object-ridden pleasures and repulsions of the mind. This is the true way of liberation. So Sri Aurobindo says the ideal here is you're not running away from the world and running away from sense objects. But realistically speaking, we can't do that very well as spiritual aspirants until we have realized God, which is tricky, especially for householders who are confronted. They have to interact with people all the time and different things. So you do your best, and then we're going to get to verse 61, which kind of holds the key, according to many commentators, to solving this difficulty that many of us face as spiritual aspirants. So now we get to verse 60. Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha. He kaunteya, O Arjuna, pramathini indriyani, the senses are pramathini, first of all. They are vehement, they're very strong and hard to control. Yatataha vipaschitaha purushasya api. This is really important. Even for that very, very sincere spiritual aspirant who is striving sincerely, who is wise, and who has discrimination, this ability, this viveka, this ability to discriminate between what's real and unreal, what's permanent and impermanent, even for that person, manaha prasabam harantihi. The mind of that person, of that wise person, can be swept away by these vehement senses. So we're never safe as spiritual aspirants. We should never, the moment we think we're safe, we're in trouble. Okay. Here, Ramanuja says something, I think Ramanuja is really at his best from verses 59 up to 65. He gives a really, I think, compelling and very practical interpretation of these verses and how they apply to our spiritual life. So, sorry, it's at the bottom here. Ramanuja's interpretation of 2.60, this verse. He says, look, here's the problem for us as spiritual aspirants. And the Sanskrit is very beautiful. Sanskrit's always nicer than the translation. Evam indriya jaya atma darshana adhina. Atma darshanam indriya jaya adhinam. It's simple Sanskrit. If you know any Indian language, it's easy to figure it out. To control the senses, that's why but I wrote it here in English. To control the senses, you have to realize the self. To realize the self, you have to control the senses. Where does that leave us? This is like the scriptures telling us to do the impossible. We're stuck in this deadlock. Jayanti, one of our online followers who answers the study questions, she used the word deadlock, and I actually like that. That's a nice way of putting it. It's like, what do we do as spiritual lives when we feel helpless? By the way, online, a few new people have joined from different countries, and I'm very happy. So somebody from Mauritius, Angela, Angele, and some other people. So I'm very happy. Welcome. Glad to have you on board. I hope you continue with the class. Okay. So this is the deadlock, which Ramanuja says is what verse 60 is all about here. In relation to, so first of all, Indriya Jaya Atma Darshana Adhina. Where does the Gita say that you cannot realize the self until you cannot control the senses until you've realized the self? He says, verse 59, Ramanuja said, in the very first, until you have realized the self, that rasa doesn't go away, that taste for sense objects, which means you can't fully control the senses. So he's reading 60 as a continuation of 59, as a logical sequence. That's important to keep in mind. And then he's reading 59 and 60 as preparing the way for, as a segue to 61, the crucial 61, both for Ramanuja and for Sri Aurobindo. So now, let's get to it. So, actually, one more thing I want to say about verse 60 here. Ramanuja is saying, this deadlock is a deadlock that any spiritual aspirant faces if you just try to practice Jnana Yoga on its own, without Bhakti Yoga and without Karma Yoga. He says it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible. For the vast majority of people, you're going to fall flat on your face. That's what he's saying. Because you're relying on your own self-effort. And that's almost impossible for most people. Not for all people, but for most people. Chapter 12 of the Gita, Krishna says the same thing again. Jnana Yoga is a path. You can realize the highest through that. But it's very, very difficult for most people. So Ramanuja is thinking already ahead of chapter 12 here. So now let's get to 61. Tāni sarvāṇi saṁyamya yukta asita matparaha vashehi yasyendriyani tasya prajñā pratisthita sarvāṇi tāni saṁyamya. The tāni here are the senses. One other thing I wanted to mention. The senses are the standard 5 senses, which we all know. Gita also, in chapter 15, includes mind as the 6th sense. Not in the 6th sense in the sense of that movie, M. Night Shyamalan, but that gets creepy. But the mind itself is a kind of sense organ, according to the Gita. So at the highest level, the most important thing to control is actually the mind, because without controlling the mind, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to control the senses. Okay. But that's a side note. So, sarvāṇi tāni saṁyamya, controlling all the senses. Ramanuja says, 61, and Sri Aurobindo too, 61 holds the key to solving this deadlock that he's talking about. Okay? Controlling all the senses, how? Yuktaha matparaha asita. You should engage in spiritual practice, matparaha. Now we go up to the top of the board. Yukta, the person who is engaged in spiritual practice, yoga, asita, and sitting. You don't have to sit physically, but matparaha. It literally means intent on me. Krishna is talking. Intent on Krishna is the literal meaning. Now, Ramanuja and Sri Aurobindo both agree. Clearly what Krishna is saying here is, you should think of me, you should meditate on me, you should pray to me, you should rely on me, you should surrender to me. This is the way out of the deadlock described in the previous verse, verse 60. Shankara thinks that this doesn't quite work. Why? Because remember, he's interpreting all these series of verses as referring to the Jnani and the Jnana Yogi, a very evolved soul who is practicing Jnana Yoga, who is dwelling on his true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, and who's beyond all this bhakti stuff. So for the Jnana Yogi, there should be no question of matparaha in the literal sense. You shouldn't be thinking of God in the sense of Krishna or the personal God. That's a lower practice. Bhakti Yoga is always a lower practice for Shankaras in his school. Bhakti Yoga, the aim of Bhakti Yoga is to purify the mind and concentrate the mind, to make one eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. But all of these verses, according to Shankara, are supposed to refer to the Jnana Yogi. So bhakti can't really play a role. So how does he interpret this matparaha? He says, you should think to yourself, I am not different from God. Matparaha. Now, how he gets that from the Sanskrit is a little tricky. I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, that's up to the Sanskrit grammarians to figure out. So I think it's more plausible to take it at face value. And as Sri Aurobindo points out, this is the first little hint of bhakti in the Bhagavad Gita. You don't find it before that, interestingly, in any of the verses. And then Sri Aurobindo points out, bhakti becomes the keynote of the entire Bhagavad Gita. Until Krishna says in verse 66 of chapter 18, my highest teaching, sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja. Abandoning all other dharmas, just surrender to me, take refuge in me. That is the highest practice. So that will ultimately be the keynote of the Gita. This is the first little trace of that, the first little hint. But we shouldn't neglect it. It's extremely important. Why is it important? For the reason Ramanuja explains very beautifully, I think, here. He puts it so succinctly. One of the online participants, when I asked that, I think there was a third study question about comparing Ramanuja's commentary with Sri Aurobindo's, and do you find them conflicting or complementary? And this person, I can't remember the person, Shubha or something, says, I like them both and they are basically complementary, but Ramanuja seems to put it in a more succinct way. Sri Aurobindo, I think, is saying the same thing. I think most of you kind of agreed that Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of these verses is, if not identical, it's very complementary to Ramanuja's. And yeah, it's arguable which one is better. I think that we can take both of them and learn from both of them. But I really like the way that Ramanuja frames the deadlock here. Okay, so why is this so important? Taking refuge in God. Ramanuja says, here's the only way to escape this deadlock. If you rely on God, pray to God, surrender to God, worship God, what happens? Chitta Shuddhi. You're able to purify your mind. Thereby, you're able to control the senses. Thereby, you ultimately are able to realize the self, your nature as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. So, bhakti is the key. And so, this is why I think that Ramanuja's philosophy is so helpful and practical for most spiritual aspirants, whereas Shankara is just too high-pitched for most people. Ramanuja suggests a three-pronged attack for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants, no matter what stage you're in, however much of a beginner you are. Try to combine to the best of your ability karma yoga, which is what this whole chapter 2, the previous verses are all about, buddhi yoga. So selfless service. Try to take the ego out of anything, whatever you're doing, and don't be attached to the work, and try to renounce fruits, your attachment to the fruits of what you're doing. Karma yoga. Combine karma yoga with bhakti yoga. This is not the highest kind of bhakti yoga that Ramanuja says very few people are eligible for. First you realize the self, then you practice. That bhakti yoga is super high level, and it's literally thinking of God all the time without any distractions. Like a taila dharavat, like an unbroken flow of oil. That's a very, very high level achievement. But you should engage in Vaidhi bhakti practices. Sri Ramakrishna talks about the difference between Vaidhi bhakti and Raga Anuga bhakti. Raga bhakti. Vaidhi bhakti is follow the devotional practice taught to you by your guru, by the scriptures. You should come to Arati, you should come to our classes, you should this and that, you should pray in the privacy of your home or your shrine, so on. All these things he encourages. Worship God. Combine that with karma yoga, and combine both those karma yoga and bhakti yoga with jnana yoga, in the sense of trying to realize that you are an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. All three need to go hand in hand. Just doing jnana yoga without karma yoga and bhakti yoga is a recipe for spiritual ruin. You're going to get stuck at a certain point, or deceive yourself and think you're making progress. You're already eligible for all sorts of high practices, but it's just not the case for most people. Okay? So that's why I think we can learn a lot from him here. And Sri Aurobindo is basically saying the same thing. He always talks about the triune yoga taught by the Bhagavad Gita, the triune yoga, the triple yoga, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga. And then, of course, a fourth will be added in chapter 6, called dhyana yoga or atma saṁyamya yoga, the yoga of self-control, meditation. Okay? Whereas Shankara, remember, this is something we always have to keep in mind. Shankara claims the same spiritual aspirant, cannot combine and should not combine jnana yoga with karma yoga, or jnana yoga with bhakti yoga. Why? Because they're meant for different levels of spiritual aspirant. Whereas Sri Aurobindo, Ramanuja say that no, the better way to read the Gita, and I think this is more plausible, this is also how I think Swami Vivekananda interprets the Gita. He says you can and should combine karma yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga, and even dhyana yoga. Okay? Okay, now we get to 62 and 63. We'll read them together and then discuss them. They're extremely important. Dhyayato Vishayan Pumsaha Sangaha Teshu Upajayate Sangat Sanjayate Kamaha Kamat Krodho Bhijayate. Good. Next verse. Krodhad. 63. Let's try it again. 63. Krodhad. Bhavati sammoha. Sammohat. Smriti vibhramaha. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Smriti vibhramaha. Smriti bhramshad. Buddhi nasho. Buddhi nashat. Pranashyati. These two verses, as I point out in the first study question, and you all did a nice job answering this first study question, describes a psychological chain reaction, starting with something that seems very innocent, dwelling on sense objects, ending in spiritual death. It's very bleak. Literally pranashyati literally means you die. Okay. So I asked in the first study question, how are these verses helpful to us as spiritual aspirants? How might these verses help people to overcome substance addictions like addiction to alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, and so on, and behavioral addictions, which are more important now, or at least they've become more serious issues these days because of internet and social media. Addiction to social media is a huge problem, especially among teenagers and others. Do they help us at all? And if so, how? And you guys really did a nice job with that. So let's look at this carefully. Okay. First link in this chain is you dwell on sense objects. Dhyayataha vishayan pumsaha. Let's look at the anvaya here. Vishayan, sense objects. Dhyayataha, dwelling on them. Pumsaha, a person. Teshu sangha upajayate. A person develops sangha, attachment, for those sense objects, whatever that sense object is. Next, first link of the chain. Second, number 2. Sangat kamaha sanjayate. From attachment comes kama, desire. Desire for that object, to possess it, to enjoy it. It doesn't end there. Kamat krodho vijayate. From kama comes krodha. I want to dwell on this a bit, and we'll get to that, because this, I think, is the most, it raises the most questions, or needs a little bit of clarification. Okay, so we'll get to that. So from kama comes krodha, and we'll talk about it. That's in the middle of this board, 2.62. Then 2.63. Krodhad, from krodha comes sammoha, delusion. Next link. Sammohat smriti vibramaha. From delusion comes smriti vibramaha. Forgetting what? Smriti vibramaha, you forget, you have loss of memory. Loss of memory of what? Different commentators have different views. So we'll see that. What do you forget exactly when you're in the grips of delusion? We'll talk about that. Then, smriti bramshad. What comes from loss of memory? Buddhi nashaha, destruction of buddhi. Buddhi, I hope you're noticing. The keynote of these past few verses, buddhi, 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 buddhi. Karma yoga, the term used in these verses is buddhi yoga. How do you best use your buddhi as a spiritual aspirant? Which is understood as intelligent will. It's not just intelligence, it's also will. The ability and willingness to act according to your best lights. Finally, buddhi nashat pranashyati. From the destruction of buddhi comes death. Spiritual death. Okay, this is the psychological chain reaction. Okay, Ramanuja, he says, why exactly does Krishna suddenly go into this thing, about this chain reaction? How does it link up with 61 and 60 and 59? This is a cautionary tale for people who try to control the senses without matparaha, without relying on God. And a lot of you notice this, pointing this out in your response to the study questions. So you see how beautifully Ramanuja strings these verses together. I really like this part of his commentary. He says, relying on self-effort is usually a recipe for disaster. One of the new online participants named Max, thank you Max, he knows a lot about Alcoholics Anonymous, and he made a nice point about this. Let me just read it out to you. He says, it's in the Lord, finally and utterly, in which we must take refuge. This recalls the 3rd step in the 12-step program of AA. And he quotes from that book, the big book, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand him. And then he says, and living in the 3rd step, or state of surrender, as members might say, and the result of taking the steps, and, quote, having had a spiritual experience, they, quote, recoil as if from a hot flame. This is the exact language used in the big book for Alcoholics Anonymous. From the intoxicants that formerly enslaved them. So this is striking because I think there's a nice parallel with the tortoise withdrawing its limbs back into its shell. So recoiling as if from a hot flame. But the more fundamental thing, which I think Max is right to point out, is that the 3rd step in the 12-step program for Alcoholics Anonymous is surrendering to a higher power as we understand him or her, or it. Without it, it's very, very difficult to succeed in overcoming your addiction. And verse 61 of the Gita seems to point to that. If you don't, and if you try to rely on your own self and your own best efforts, what happens? Dhyayato vishan pumsaha. This chain reaction sets in, ultimately leading to your spiritual ruin, and that addiction is going to come back again. Okay. Oh, another thing I want to mention about verse 59, about how that rasa, that taste for sense objects, doesn't disappear until self-realization, since we're talking about AA. Another thing, I have friends who are in AA. What they say is, even once you've overcome the addiction in a sense, you still have to call yourself an alcoholic. You're never not an alcoholic. For the rest of your life, you're an alcoholic. Some people don't like that, but that's up to you. And there are different programs with different... But what's the logic behind that? The logic is the moment you think you're no longer an alcoholic, the mind can play tricks and say, so now I can go to a bar, I can have one drink. What's the harm in that? Chain reaction again begins again. And then you're lost. Spiritual death, spiritual ruin. Better to say, I'm an alcoholic, I have the rasa. Alcoholic just means I still have the rasa inside. And I'm not going to pretend that I don't. Even though I don't freak out when I see somebody else drinking or whatever, that doesn't mean I'm safe, I'm out of the woods. I think that's the logic behind, or the wisdom behind saying, calling yourself an alcoholic even after you become sober, even after many years or decades. Okay, now, I wanted to dwell at some length on this, on 1, 2, 3, I think the fourth link in the chain. Kamat krodho vijayate. From kama comes krodha. Angeli, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. I don't know how to pronounce the E at the end of your name. From Mauritius, she asked a really interesting question about this. Let me read you her question. She says, do these verses 2.62 and 63 explain that anger always arises from unfulfilled desires? Would hate and irritation be explained by unfulfilled desires also? Thank you very much. Is her question. I think it's a really nice question. And it's a question that I have. When I first read these verses, every link in the chain, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, all makes perfect sense to me. It's beautiful. You can teach a whole psychology class based on... This one I get tripped up over because it feels a little bit like too narrow or something. From desire comes anger. Does anger always come from desire? I think it's an open question. I want you all to think about it for yourself.
Frustration of desire. Frustration of desire.
But what happens when you are able to get the object of your desire? That's the question that I have when I read this link in the chain.
To me,
what happens when you're able to fulfill a desire? Maybe you just have bad luck, people, and then you get angry. Fine, then the chains. But what if you get what you want? How do you explain it? How does this chain reaction still happen? Now, I think Sri Aurobindo really helps here. Okay, because if you read his commentary really carefully, what you're going to find is he interprets krodha. Let me step back a bit. Traditional commentators, almost always, this is where Shankara and Ramanuja, no matter how often they disagree with each other, they agree on this. Krodha means anger. This is the standard interpretation of what krodha means. In Sanskrit, it is the literal meaning of krodha, anger. Okay? Sri Aurobindo has a bit of a different take. He fully accepts that anger is a part of what krodha means, but it doesn't exhaust the meaning of krodha in this context. Okay? Let's open the app commentary. This is one of those places where it's...
But it doesn't have, but it has it in the next one.
Go to the next one, 2.63, because they're of a piece. And so go to 2.63 and open the commentary, the text box. He says, that is because the mind naturally lends itself to the senses. Are you there? You're following? Mm-hmm. Good. It observes the objects of sense with an inner interest, settles upon them, and makes them the object of absorbing thought for the intelligence and of strong interest for the will. First link in the chain. By that attachment comes. Dhyato vishan pumsaha, sangasteshu upajayate. By attachment, desire. Sangat sanjayate kamaha. By desire, notice this. This is how he's explaining the fourth link in the chain. By desire, now he's explaining krodha as distress, passion, and anger. When the desire is not satisfied or is thwarted or opposed. And then notice again in the next link of the chain, link 5, he says, and by passion, he's choosing to render krodha as passion. By passion, the soul is obscured. That's the sammoha. The intelligence and will forget to see and be seated in the calm observing soul. There is a fall from the memory of one's true self. Notice, he's saying what you lose memory of, smriti brahmsha, is loss of the memory of what you truly are, your true spiritual nature, as a soul separate from the body-mind complex, and as a child of God. And by that lapse, the intelligent will is also obscured, destroyed even. The buddhi. Intelligent will is his beautiful definition of buddhi, or translation of buddhi. For the time being, it no longer exists to our memory of ourselves. It disappears in a cloud of passion. we become passion, wrath, grief, and cease to be self and intelligence and will. This then must be prevented, and all the senses brought utterly under control. For only by an absolute control of the senses can the wise and calm intelligence be firmly established in its proper seat. So notice, Sri Aurobindo here is interpreting Krodha in a broader way. And I think this at least is going in the right direction of interpreting this fourth link in the chain. If you take it just to mean anger, I think it's somehow incomplete. Because for people who are lucky, they have desires, but they if they have enough money and they're good looking or whatever, they get what they want. And if their karma favors them, they get what they want. So why would they be angry? So here's my take on it. There are two scenarios when you have a desire. Okay, so let's go back to the third link in the chain. You have kama, you have desire for a particular sense object. One scenario is you get what you want, you get the desire you want. What happens? You're satisfied for some time. But a little bit later, what happens? Bhagavata Purana has a beautiful verse. King Yayati, after thousands of years of bhoga, he comes to this insight. He says, Na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati havisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivadate. Desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. Rather, if you're trying to put out a fire and you throw clarified butter or oil into it, what happens? The fire gets bigger. So the ultimate result of satisfying a desire for something external is that the desire for that sense object increases, it intensifies. And so ultimately, you're going to end up frustrated. Not necessarily angry, but at least frustration, distress, that's another word used by Sri Aurobindo. That's the whole structure of addiction. When I take heroin for the first time, I need just whatever, I have no idea, but 0.5 ounce of whatever the thing is. But I get such a euphoria, I do it again and again. Ultimately, I'll need 0.75 of the same thing. Then I need 1 ounce of the whole. I need more and more of the same substance to satisfy me, and it's never enough. That's why the world's most famous and beautiful celebrities in the world, right? They marry the most beautiful people, and they still cheat on them. Why are they not satisfied with supermodels and with billionaires who are not satisfied with $1 billion? They want $10 billion. $10 billion, not enough. I want $100 billion. There's no end. So if you take krodha to mean not just anger, but dissatisfaction, frustration, distress, and passion is another word. Passion, I think it means just sort of, desire is all-consuming. It becomes all-consuming in the end if you live a life oriented around these desires. That's why in chapter 3 of the Gita, Krishna says desire, he uses 2 words. Mahashano mahapapma. He says kama is mahashano, all-devouring. It's never satisfied. And 2, mahapapma is the root of all sin. It makes us do the worst and stupidest things imaginable. Because our judgment is clouded, and the 63 beautifully explains why, with each step in the chain as to why that happens. Okay? So I really like Sri Aurobindo's take on this link in the chain, 2.62, kamat krodho vijayate, because if you just take it as anger, I don't think it quite works. I think you have to take it in a broader way. So the anger explains if we don't get what we want. That's great. But what happens when we do get what we want? Well, it's not quite anger what that happens, but it's ultimately we become frustrated because we need more and more of the same thing to satisfy us. And we become more and more passionate as a result. And then sometimes we resort to crime. Drug addicts, often they end up in jail because of that. They have to break in to get more of the substance they want, or to get money to buy the drugs they need, or whatever it is. Do you see what I mean? Or addiction to behaviors like social media use. Literally, you cannot take yourself off the phone. Even in the middle of the night, you wake up and you have to check who's texting me or what somebody said on Instagram or whatever. It's literally an addiction just as much as heroin or something else is. Okay?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels to even, like say in Drigdrisha Viveka, they use only one of the organs, but they say unlike. And similarly, it seems like it's passion, anger, like. Anything can be fit in the word here.
But is the word krodha used in Drigdrisha Viveka? I don't think so.
No, it's not. But I'm saying even there, they use like say only one of the organ names are in a sense.
Oh, but it includes others.
But they will, in the commentary they write and like.
And more.
And more.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's very similar here.
Right.
Anything that's causing the turbulence.
Krodha is anger and kindred states. If we just take it a little bit more broadly, I think it really helps. And then it becomes a very, very profound psychological explanation of the nature of worldliness and addiction, and one thing I think Leela makes a nice point here, as far as I understood your response to one of the study questions. She suggests it's not just about addiction. We're all addicts in a certain sense. Every single one of us is here because we're addicted to the world in some sense. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this body. Holy Mother and Sri Ramakrishna, they say we wouldn't be in a body and take birth again unless we had some desires. So we're all addicted to something. Okay, so I think that's a healthy. That makes these verses apply to all of us, not just people who are addicted to certain substances or certain behaviors. Oh, I'm not addicted to social media. I'm not a drug addict. You're still an addict in some sense. That's why our karma is dragging us back again and again to this world. So all of us have to break an addiction to some form of worldliness, in some form. So these verses are universal. They apply to all of us. The other thing is that other link in the chain that comes later, the sixth link, sammohat smriti vibhramaha. From delusion comes smriti vibhrama, loss of memory. I mentioned that different commentators have different takes on what exactly we lose memory of. Sri Aurobindo, clearly, we just read his commentary, takes it to mean loss of memory of one's true self. The jivatma, a soul separate from the body-mind complex. Because it's if we identify there would be no violence, there would be no crimes really, if we just saw ourselves and others as souls. That would instantly transform society overnight. It's very hard. I mean, it's not so easy. Just try as a spiritual aspirant. We have Swamiji used to say, when I'm on the heights, I say I am he, I am that Atman. When I have a bellyache, I call on Mother. Because we're not always on the heights and it becomes difficult. Memory. Smriti vibhramaha. Ramanuja says it's loss of memory of our prior efforts at self-control. Because as sadhakas, as spiritual aspirants, we're trying to control ourselves. We forget all that. And then we just get swept away in this whirlpool of delusion, and we ultimately die spiritually. Shankara takes it to mean loss of memory of what the scriptures teach us and what the Guru tells us. And I take all of these as kind of complementary. I don't see any reason why we need to take one at the expense of the others. They're not mutually exclusive. And Gita, I think, deliberately leaves open. Loss of memory of what? Of so many things. Of our own prior spiritual practices, what our Guru told us to do, what these great scriptures like Bhagavad Gita tell us to do. You'll find in moments of passion, you forget everything. This is a very, very practical and realistic thing. So what is the ultimate teaching of 62 and 63? Nip it in the bud. Because if you let the chain go on up to link 4, 5, 6, you're already kind of lost. Because then you become almost completely enslaved to that chain reaction. So nip it in the bud from the very beginning. What's the ultimate takeaway from 62 and 63? Try not to dwell on sense objects so much. That's it. Yeah. At the first step in the chain is where you need to address the issue. Don't dwell so much on sense objects. That means, now, ultimately it means, so even if you abstain from, even if that sense object is not in front of you, if you're thinking about it all the time, that itself is a problem. And you might say, well then how in the world do we do that? Matparaha, verse 61. Anytime a worldly thought comes, replace it with a thought of God. Not the easiest thing to do, but it's practical. And it's doable. It's just something that you have to work at. That's the whole point of spiritual practice. Nobody said spiritual life is easy. But and you have to be mindful. What happens often is, you'll find this as a spiritual aspirant. You're dwelling on something worldly. You don't even know you're dwelling on, you're not mindful enough at the moment to even think, because you're so enamored with that object. Until the viveka, the buddhi kicks in. And then suddenly oh, wait a minute, I shouldn't be thinking that. And then you can call on God. So you need to, it's a two-pronged attack. Buddhi yoga. That means you need to be exercising your intelligent will and be mindful as a spiritual aspirant. So when you're dwelling on sense objects, you can catch yourself in the act. Because unless you can catch yourself in the act, you're not going to be able to take a step back and then call on God and replace that worldly thought with the thought of God. Does that make sense? So I think these verses are extremely practical and helpful, I think, in spiritual life. Okay, so I want to conclude by discussing the last two verses because they all kind of go together. So 64 and 65 describe the person, after describing this cautionary tale of somebody who does not call on God. What happens? Spiritual ruin, spiritual death. For the person who does rely on God and who is able to control the senses, this is the state of that person. And again, he's coming back to this realized soul, really, the person who is doing things the right way. We'll read them both together, 64 and 65. ragadvesha
ragadvesha
vimuktaistu
vimukhtaistu
vishayan
vishayan
indriyaishcharan
indriyaishcharan
atmavashyaihi
atmavashyaihi
vidheyatma
vidheyatma
prasadam
prasadam
adhigacchati
adhigacchati
prasade
prasade
sarvadukkhanam
sarvadukkhanam
hanihi
hanihi
asyopajayate
asyopajayate
prasannachetaso
prasannachetaso
hyashu
hyashu
buddhihi
buddhihi
paryavatishthate.
paryavatishthate.
Okay, so let me read the translation, Aurobindo's translation of both these verses together. It is by ranging over the objects with the senses, but with senses subject to the self, freed from liking and disliking, that one gets into a large and sweet clearness of soul and temperament in which passion and grief find no place. The intelligence of such a man is rapidly established. So remember, when we read Sri Aurobindo's previous commentary, he's saying that the goal here is not to run off to a cave. The goal is, in the midst of sense objects, to be unaffected by them and to be free from raga and dvesha. These verses, 64 and 65, describe that state. It's a high state. And let's not pretend that we've already achieved that level of spiritual evolution. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Always be aware of self-deception here. But this is a high state in which you can be confronted with the sense objects. This reminds me of when one householder devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, I forgot his name, in front of his wife, he kind of calls out Sri Ramakrishna and says, why is it that you're eating pan and sometimes you talk to women? Well, he really talked about pan, really, and I think fish or something like that. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, I'll eat 100 pans, I'll dance naked with 1,000 women. What is that to you? It's because he's at a very, very high stage. He has no idea whom he's talking to. He's talking to an avatara who's beyond all these things. You see, it's very, let's not pretend we're Sri Ramakrishna. That's the whole point. That'd be the ultimate self-delusion, self-deception, right? But Sri Ramakrishna, people like him, Swami Vivekananda, after he gave that incredible stirring speech at the World's Powerful Religions, which Raja Chaudhary, who happens to be here, it's an honor to have him here. He's the filmmaker behind the documentary, America's First Guru. He starts with Swamiji's, amazing speech, Afterward, one of the people in the audience, this American lady, she writes later in Reminiscence, she says, you should have seen what happened after the speech. Beautiful young women are just running after him, like trying to grab onto his hem. And then she just thought to herself, she said, if he can resist the onslaught of these women, then he must be a realized. So he must be one of the greatest spiritual saints that the world has ever known. Swamiji, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna, they embody this 64 to 65 kind of situation. Even the other brother disciples, Swami Vivekananda said, he warned his brother disciples, he said, if any of you try to imitate me, you're going to fall. You're going to fall. It's not so easy. I wanted to mention, well, actually, let me stop there and open it to questions because we only have a few minutes left. So any questions about any of these verses that we talked about today? Otherwise, there are a few questions from you guys, from the study questions and from online yet. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not a regular on this, but
yeah.
I want to just ask you something. That Sri Aurobindo says later also in other work that the seeing Vasudevaya in everything, right, was also a practice that happened to him in jail, and then
yes,
and to be able to convert everything you look at, transmute it into the divine.
Yes.
Is that a stepping stone for an aspirant to use? Is that a good way of doing it?
It could be, and it depends on the spiritual aspirant. Right. For some people, that's extremely helpful from the beginning. For others, it could be dangerous because it could be a kind of a way to justify bhoga.
So the heroine becomes a god.
Heroine becomes God. That person you're doing all sorts of worldly stuff with becomes God, and it's all God. So I'm it's fine.
So you're gonna lose it a little.
You
bit.
can, and so it's tricky. So it's dangerous. I think that that I'm famous for teaching Vijnana Vedanta, right? So yes, everything is God. But for spiritual aspirants, I think the best way to practice that is what Sri Ramakrishna calls Shiva Jnane Jiva Seva. Serve others in a spirit of worship by trying to see God in everyone. But the moment you start sort of justifying everything you're doing in the world by saying that, oh, but that person that I'm interacting with is God, and that thing I'm doing is also a manifestation of the divine, that in most cases is a recipe for self-deception and spiritual death. So we should be honest with ourselves and be careful about that, especially these days. It's easy to say and very difficult to practice.
Just to follow on.
Yeah, please.
So the idea. So in other teachings, we hear the thing about Turiya and this idea of the observer, the enlightened witness. Does one become that by doing this practice? If let's say, for example, the devotional path is you're more drawn to non-dualism and not devotion.
Yeah.
By becoming Turiya, by becoming detached, can you then be observing yourself doing those things?
Yeah, but again, the danger of you can. But then we have the other incident from Sri Ramakrishna's life, that sadhu who visited from a different state in India, a sannyasi, who's obviously supposed to be celibate and not having any relationships. Sri Ramakrishna hears that he's having an affair with a woman. He confronts him about it. And he's a follower of classical Advaita, what you just said, identified with Turiya, supposedly. And Sri Ramakrishna said, what does it say here about this affair you're having? He says, let me explain. You see, everything is Maya. If that's true, how can my affair with that woman alone be real? It's also Maya. So that's literally identifying with Sakshi and saying that very thing I'm doing is also part of Maya. It's unreal, so I can do it. It's not me. I'm not the body mind after all. So let the body mind do whatever it wants. So it can easily lead to self-deception. That's the danger.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we have to be careful about it. And what you'll find is if you're really in that state, you can't engage in those kinds of activities. It's not possible anymore. It's the last thing you would do. Sri Ramakrishna would say, you cannot take a false step once you've learned how to dance as a master dancer. That's the idea. So that means realizing God. Once you realize God, you can't take a false step. Any other questions? There's one online which let me just read you quickly. Parimal asks, Sri Ramanuja on his commentary on verses 55, 56, 57, and 58 classify the 4 stages in the development of Brahmi Sthiti. Remember I mentioned that, the 4 stages in reverse order of Jnana Nishtha, devotion of the path of Jnana Yoga. Can you please elaborate on this? Is this description similar to yogic pratyahara and samadhi? It's a good question. It's just I'm not enough of an expert in Ramanuja, and he doesn't give enough details, but we'd have to look at each of the verses individually. I think it's clear that the last verse you can easily take that to be more of a preliminary practice, because like the tortoise, you're just trying to restrain the senses from sense objects. It means that there's a lot of temptation there, and the rasa is very strong for sense objects. You can see that. And the first verse in Sri Krishna's answer to Arjuna is clearly a very high state. Prajahati yada kaman sarvāṇi pātamanogatan. When you have completely eliminated all desires from the mind and heart, then you are sthita prajna. Clearly that is a state of samadhi, and it's a very, very high state. You don't have that until you realize the highest. The 2 middle verses in between are a little bit trickier. Exactly how you can read the penultimate verse in that set of 4 as the stage 2, and the one before that is stage 3. I think that's open to interpretation, and you can feel free to interpret in your own way. And if it's helpful to you as a spiritual aspirant, go ahead and do it. If not, then I don't think it's worth obsessing too much about mapping it onto the 4 stages. But I think it's an interesting interpretation. Any final question before we wrap it up? No? Great. Thanks a lot, guys. See you guys on Sunday, June 23rd. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.